My kidneys are one of the main reasons I travel in groups when I'm in a foreign country. Kidneys are pretty important, and I'm not going to cover all the reasons why. In this video, I'm going to cover a few things. I'm going to start out with the things that control blood flow in the kidney. So control the renal blood flow. I'm going to take a look at how to calculate renal blood flow. Then we'll look at some of the pathologies that cause changes in renal blood flow, and I'll just put delta RBF to represent that. And lastly, we'll look at some renal hormones. Renal blood flow, the regulations of renal blood flow can either be external or internal. When it's internal, it's called autoregulation. Now, the reason we know internal, one of the main reasons that people start investigating this autoregulation is because when you cut the nerve supply to the kidney, like whenever you have a kidney transplant, the kidney can still regulate its own blood flow into the afferent arterioles. There are several external regulators for the blood flow to the kidney. Just to mention some of the main ones, the sympathetic nervous system. You have innervation to the muscles that go into the afferent and efferent arterioles, and they can be controlled by the catecholamines released by the sympathetic nervous system. You also have atrionatriuretic peptide, and this one's called brain natriuretic peptide because it was first found in the brain, but it's actually, the theory is that it's actually produced by the ventricles of the heart. And so some places will call this B-type natriuretic peptide, or they'll call it VNP for ventricle. You also get a little bit of regulation from dopamine. I'm not going to go into all the mechanisms of these. One thing I want to mention that's really important, or not really important, but really interesting, is that whenever you have the sympathetic innervation, the catecholamines are going to bind to alpha-1 receptors, and so there's more alpha-1 receptors on the afferent. So there's more on the afferent arterioles. So there's going to be a larger, and this causes vasoconstriction, so there's going to be a larger effect. So afferent effect is going to be greater than efferent effect. And what that essentially leads to is that you're going to always get a decreased glomerular filtration rate with the alpha-1 receptors. Now let's take a look at autoregulation. And what this graph here shows, what this graph here shows is zacnephron. But this graph is showing, on the bottom we're plotting the systemic blood pressure, and then along this axis we're plotting the flow of blood through the kidneys. And so you can see that right around 70 all the way up to about 200 blood pressure. So between these ranges, the kidney keeps a very constant blood flow, and it does that by regulating the dilation of the afferent and efferent arterioles. A pressure much below 70 and you're going to start getting renal failure, and if it gets too low, the kidneys will just shut down and they'll die. And so the first form of autoregulation that I want to talk about is called the myogenic response. And this is also sometimes called the myogenic hypothesis because it's still in the hypothesis stage, but there's pretty good evidence for it. And so what we have is, here's my Bowman's capsule, okay? And going into the Bowman's capsule, we have the afferent arterial, and then going out as the efferent arterial. And I'm going to give it some dimension here. When blood flow is normal, then you get no stretching of the arterial. Now note I said normal. Normal is relative whenever it's physiological or whenever there's not being any change made. But whenever blood flow increases, it starts to stretch the afferent arterial. And what happens is the muscles, the smooth muscles that are going around that, whenever they're stretched, it allows for calcium to, it opens up mechanical calcium channels. So these calcium channels open up and it causes these muscles to contract, And so when they contract, they get smaller and they squeeze the vasculature back down to where it needs to be. Oh, I just heard something. What's that, Zach? What's that? Oh, okay, yeah, I'll let him know. Zach Nephron just asked me to make sure you guys know that most autoregulation takes place in the afferent arterioles. The next type of autoregulation is called tubuloglomerular feedback. There's a pretty little chart here, but I'm going to go ahead and draw it out to explain it a little bit better. So note that I have my afferent arteriole, and blood's moving in this way, as indicated by the arrow, and moving out through the efferent arteriole. If blood flow is very high, then what's going to happen is we're going to get a lot of filtrate. So we get a lot of, so the filtrate, I'm going to draw it in as blue, a lot of filtrate coming in here, and it's going to be carrying with it a bunch of solutes. So we'll just put a whole bunch of sodium and chlorine in here. It's going to be carrying a whole bunch of solutes with it. And typically these solutes could get moved across the membrane as they come down and transferred over into the extracellular spaces. But whenever the flow is too high, it moves the solutes in too quickly and they can't be reabsorbed. So what we're going to get in that case is the solutes are going to move all the way up to this portion of the tubule. Now this portion would be the distal convoluted tubule, and some textbooks will draw this whole thing out like as if it comes down here and then comes back up over here. But the fact of the matter is the distal convoluted tubule actually passes right by Bowman's capsule. And right near this area, these tubules have something called a macula densa that can sense solute concentrations. So it senses solute concentrations. And most theories say that it's sensing either sodium or chloride or both. But we still don't know exactly for sure which one's acting. But whenever it senses a high solute concentration, so we have a high solute concentration, it will secrete. It causes secretion of a paracrine, which is a vasoactive substance. And when solute concentration is too low, it will secrete some other vasoactive substance to work in the opposite manner. Oh, I think I hear something. Hold on. What's that, Zach Nephron? Okay, yeah, I'll let him know. Okay, Zach Nephron wants me to make sure that you are aware that nobody knows for sure what this vasoactive substance is, but there are a few theories. And so the theories are, it could be adenosine, it could be ATP, it could be thromboxane. What I'd like to do is zoom all the way into the cellular level. So at increased magnification, as we go all the way down to the cellular level, we can see this proposed mechanism where we have the macula densa cells on the left, and on the right, this says extraglomerular, or I'm thinking most textbooks call it juxtaglomerular cells. But you have the sodium, chlorine, maybe even potassium being sensed at higher concentrations, and as such, it can cause ATP to come out here, bind to receptors, and cause vasoconstriction. And it also can cause the release of renin, which we're going to get to in a moment. The fact that it just causes vasoconstriction by itself is called the tubuloglomerular feedback. You know you have two kidneys when you're in love. Now let's talk about the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system and how it regulates it. And so the first thing, let's go ahead and redraw our Bowman's capsule. So this is the Bowman's capsule. And incoming we have the afferent, exiting we have the efferent. Now on that system, especially on the afferent, you get a high concentration of what's called the juxtaglomerular cells, and there's a few on the efferent, but not nearly as much. These juxtaglomerular cells, they exist right at the entrance or exit to the glomerulus. Now, if the pressure inside the glomerulus is too chronically high, it means it's really high for a really long time, it's going to cause damage to the glomerular filtration system. So it can cause damage to the capsule. It can cause damage to the capillary itself because of all the podocytes and everything that it takes to maintain the integrity of the capillary bed. But if the glomerular filtration is too low, then that's a problem too, because the filtrate that's coming out of here, all of the solutes and everything, they are actually important to feeding the rest of the nephron. And so we think of the capillaries. The capillaries contain all these solutes, and those solutes are important to feeding some of the cells inside of the nephron. So you don't want the pressure to be chronically too high. If it's too high, remember, you're going to get the solutes coming out, activating the macula densa, and it's going to cause some vasoconstriction. But if it's chronically low, you're also going to get the macula densa to say, hey, secrete renin. So there's three things that will cause renin to be secreted. The macula densa, like I just said, low blood pressure, so baroreceptors, and as I understand the text, the baroreceptors are actually in this juxtaglomerular cells. I can't confirm that 100% because it's just too vague. I'm going to cut to the chase and kind of give you a sneak peek. Ultimately, the renin-angiotensin aldosterone system, angiotensin 2, as a matter of fact, will cause a vasoconstriction of both of these arteries. At low levels, it will cause a higher vasoconstriction on the efferent than on the afferent. So you'll have an increased glomerular filtration because this will constrict a little, this will constrict a lot, and so the blood's flowing in. It's slowing down here, but it's slowing way down in here because it's harder to push through, and so it gets pushed out this way. And so whenever your blood pressure goes down, you can still get the filtration that you need to feed the kidney. However, whenever you have a beta-adrenergic is going to close this one down quite a bit, and the angiotensin 2 is going to close this one down quite a bit, and so the whole thing is going to drop off, and glomerular filtration is going to drop off as well. So that's what happens when you go into shock. Anyhow, so now you've produced a lot of renin. You have all this renin floating around in the blood, and it comes into contact with something called angiotensinogen. I don't even know why I wrote a C there. It's angiotensinogen. So you ask yourself, where does the angiotensinogen come from? Good question. It comes from the liver. The liver is always making angiotensinogen, and it's just always secreting it out in the blood, and it's just always in the blood everywhere, just like fibrinogen, for example. The liver makes a lot of inactive plasma proteins in this manner, and so whenever your renin is secreted by the kidney, it's going to bump into the angiotensinogen, and it's going to convert it into angiotensin 1. Couple of things that are interesting to note. So the presence of angiotensin in the blood, I think specifically it's angiotensin 2, which we're going to get to, but the presence of angiotensin in the blood causes the liver to secrete more angiotensinogen. Now the next thing that's going to happen is the angiotensin is going to go into the lungs. So the lungs, all of the blood in your body eventually goes into the lungs, and the lungs have an enzyme called angiotensin converting enzyme, or ACE. And this enzyme will cause the angiotensin 1 to be converted to angiotensin 2. So angiotensin, and usually it's with Roman numerals, but I like the number 2. And so sometimes you've heard of ACE inhibitors. That's what they're stopping. They're stopping the conversion of angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2. However, there's another interesting thing is that mast cells have something called chymase, and they contain this enzyme called chymase, and chymase can actually convert angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. And now let me give another caveat. I'm not sure if chymase is converting angiotensin 1 or if it's converting angiotensinogen to angiotensin 2. There really was, I could not tell. Again, the literature was ambiguous. Or I should say the literature that I found and took the time to look up was ambiguous. So moving on. The angiotensin 2 is then going to go to the adrenal gland. So there's my kidney, and sitting on top of it is this little triangle we call the adrenal gland, and it's going to act on the adrenal gland to produce aldosterone. So aldosterone. Now, three things can actually cause the production secretion of aldosterone. So the first one would be a low serum sodium, so hyponatremia. The second one would be a high serum potassium, so hyperkalemia. And then finally, the third thing would be hypovolemia, or anything that would cause the production of that would eventually cause the production of the angiotensin 2. So now that you know what caused the production of aldosterone, guess what it does? Guess what it does? It causes the reabsorption of sodium, it causes the excretion of potassium, and it causes the reabsorption of water, which is just following sodium. So big picture here is this: the kidneys say, hey, the blood pressure is low because I'm not filtering enough stuff in my urine, and so it produces all these things that eventually cause it to reabsorb water and sodium to keep the blood pressure at least modestly high. So the big picture here is that renal blood flow, we're asking a question: what controls renal blood flow? Renal blood flow it can be controlled by, under physiological conditions, it can be controlled by external things, and it can be controlled by internal things. And so I guess I should have just flipped to my slide a little bit earlier, because I have some more stuff written here. If you want to pause this and read it, I'm going to go on because I've explained pretty much all of it. Again, more stuff here I've already explained. Pause if you want. Now that I spent 9 minutes on math, I'm going to try to quickly go through some of the rest of the stuff. So decreases in renal blood flow, pathological decreases. You get hypovolemia, aortic coarctation, aortic dissection, nervous system problems, cardiogenic shock. Unilateral is going to be a renovascular disease, and it includes all of these things. So you can read through those. So if you're from South Africa, or if you're from Africa, I think it was South Africa, Takayasu's arteritis, an embolic renal disease. So all these things, you can read through those. Hello, kidney. So what do you say to a patient who has kidney stones? You let them know you're in good hands. So hormones produced by the kidney include erythropoietin and vitamin D. Renin is not a hormone; it's an enzyme. And then here I've listed a few hormones that act on the kidney. One thing I didn't put in this list was antidiuretic hormone. Some of the stuff I've already went through, like HO natriuretic peptide and brain natriuretic peptide. Something I don't think I remember talking about, prostaglandins, which, if you remember, that's a byproduct of arachidonic acid. And so what happens is, whenever the fight or flight, the sympathetic nervous system activates, it will cause a decrease in glomerular filtration. It'll cause the vasoconstriction of the afferent and efferent arterioles. But if those were left just by themselves, it would decrease everything so much that things would just shut down. So at the same time, it causes the production of prostaglandins, which has a little bit of a vasodilation effect. And so the prostaglandins will moderate the effect of sympathetic response. Now, if you're taking an NSAID, then that will prevent the production of prostaglandins, and in the case of fight or flight response, it could cause some problems, or in a case of, say, for like hemodynamic instability. And that's all I got. My sources include Costanzo, and there was a really good article on a UK website called patient.co.uk/renal-vascular-disease.htm, and the article is called Renovascular Disease. So that I want to recommend that as a source as well. And I watched a lot of YouTube videos. I also referenced Stewart, Ira, and Fox's Physiology textbook. I resourced the Gold and Dyer Pathophysiology for Health Professionals. Then lastly, I would like to recommend ABOB's. It's ABOB's Lung and Renal. And it was the article on that website called Glomerular Function. So glomerular function, and that website was on sites.google. So sites.google.com/sites/ABOB's Lung and Renal, all one word, /home/glomerulars-function.